Hey guys, this is going to be my first impressions video on the new Head Speed Tour. I've been playing with it for at least 3 or 4 weeks, both in practice, competitive, and even tournament play. So I have a pretty good idea of how this plays already, but still kind of messing around with the strings and a little bit of customizations to see what my optimal specs are. And I'll leave that kind of for the final review. As it's only my first impressions video, I'll be just talking about the general characteristics and the playability of this frame, just to give you an idea of what this is like. But I will make some comparisons to other competing head frames in the lineup just to give you a reference point of where it kind of stands. Safe to say, I thought this was a very positive experience in terms of overall playability. I think the frame itself is quite impressive. When I first heard of the new mold, I was kind of leaning towards the new Speed MP rather than the 97, but after playing with this for some time, I think this is actually a really nice choice for a lot of high, intermediate to advanced players. So just taking a look at the specs, it's got a 97 square inch head size, which is new to the lineup, obviously, 305 gram unstrung weight. And if you kind of put it together with the Pro Staff, this is the RF97, you'll see that they kind of do line up quite closely together. So the shape is not that dissimilar in terms of what a 97 traditionally would be, but the difference, obviously, it has a much thicker beam compared to your traditional 97s. But you got an unstrung weight of 305 grams, and the string pattern of 1619 is quite tight, actually, which is a bit of a surprise given that it's already a smaller head size. But I wouldn't be too worried about the tight string pattern because the spin potential is actually very good on this racket. It has a strong balance of about 32.5 centimeters, which is around 6 points headlight. The stiffness rating is listed about 61 RA stiffness, and it has a beam width of 23 millimeters, which is same as the Speed MP and the Pro. When you kind of look at it, it is basically a Speed mold condensed into a 97 square inch head size. But just in terms of overall playability, I would kind of put it in between a Radical MP and the Gravity Tour. The Radical MP is still actually one of my favorite head frames to play with. It has that kind of one-to-one control, no frills approach, super versatile because it's extremely maneuverable. You can kind of perform any shot you want with it, and I find it to be one of the nicest one-hand backhand rackets currently. That extreme maneuverability is basically a way of being able to play whatever kind of shot you want, be creative as you want. Obviously, the caveat is that it requires a full user-generated experience, so any kind of pace and spin that you're looking to get is going to have to come purely from your technique and nothing else. That's what I like about it, because when I'm practicing with it, it's just a racket that I'm always super consistent with. I miss way less, make a lot more balls, and it's just a great racket to practice with. Obviously, using that kind of racket against very high-level players that are better than me, it might obviously be a disadvantage, but in terms of just like kind of grooving your strokes and getting rhythm, I think it's a fantastic racket. The Gravity Tour is a bit more on the opposite side of the spectrum, where it's a lot more flexible at the throat. Obviously still has a crisp feeling string bed, but that kind of feel is what I prefer the most. I come from a very old school traditional kind of preference in terms of like the PT57A and those kinds of frames in terms of soft feel and flex. But that really wide open string pattern gives you a nice boost in the power and spin potential compared to the Radical MP, even though the beam is only slightly thicker. It is a more modernized classic control racket, so kind of fits a profile for players who want some kind of boost in some of the power and spin, but still looking for that classic feel. So the Speed Tour kind of takes the best from both worlds because of this smaller head size, 97. You don't really feel it, to be honest, compared to like any regular 98. Obviously, this 23 millimeter beam is going to be a lot more powerful than what you would get from a traditional Pro Staff 97, Percept 97. It's not like as maneuverable as the Radical MP, but still very highly maneuverable and more maneuverable than the Gravity Tour. And that's because the Gravity Tour, like a lot of the modern day rackets in the last couple years, have distributed a lot of the weight in the throat and the lower half of the racket. Not so much to the top necessarily, but generally a lot of the rackets today, they have a lot of throat weight and weight in the sides of the racket for torsional stability. And the overall idea is that they're been decreasing maneuverability for the sake of torsional stability at lower weights and also lower swing weights. And you can see this in rackets that stemmed from the transition between the Aero VS to the Aero 98, which kind of, I think, started the trend because of how popular it was. You can see this transition into the Blade V9, the E-Zone 98, the entire new V-Core line, which is one of the most prevalent changes for that. And yeah, the new gravities as well. They also changed it up and compared to the previous generations. The thing with this new speed tour is that they went for a more natural approach with the weight being evenly distributed throughout the frame. So that means that you're going to have a lot more maneuverability overall. And it's kind of like the preference of what I have come accustomed to in more recent years. So as I said before, looking at the mold, it's kind of the Speed MP kind of condensed into a 97. And you might be wondering what was the purpose of that, and that is basically to do with that maneuverability aspect, because the Speed MP from especially the Graphene 360 era was, to me, a very versatile racket. They kind of used a lot lower swing weights. They even had a lower static weight to begin with at an unstrung weight. In the last few generations, they've really crept up that swing weight to compensate for more stability and power. But the problem is that user friendliness kind of disappeared over time, and I found that a lot of people using the previous gen Auxetic 2.0 white speed, they were having to play a lot heavier for some of those swing weights that were kind of averaging around the 330 range. So now with the 97 having a much more maneuverable beam, that kind of opens up the doors for some people wanting to try out the speed, because I think it definitely is a nice blend. You could basically pair it within the 98 range of the head control rackets, and you're going to have people who will like the Radical MP, who will like the Gravity Tour, may like the Extreme Pro, but then I think even as close as they all are in terms of playability, there's still specific aspects of each frame that kind of suit different players, and this kind of fills in that gap as well. So if you want to know about power, it's not really a underpowered racket being a 97, and it's not an overpowered racket being a slightly thicker beam than what you would traditionally get from a 97, but maybe people who are used to those kinds of 95s, 90s, or the normal 97s may find it a creep up in the power levels. Like I said, I don't think it's overly powered. I think it's a nice balance. You do still have to be more fluid and still have good technique to generate the power, especially if you really want a big finishing shot against a high level player. But there's still enough to do damage overall with moderately high swing speed. I wouldn't be putting it in the range of any other modern day 98. Obviously not anywhere near like the Aeros and the V-Cores, but maybe comparable to something of the Extreme Pro and Gravity Tour range. Hard to say which one's more or less, because they all do provide decent amount of power. But I think depending on the swing, you're going to find some people will think it's more and some people will think it's less than those frames. But obviously much more than your typical Control 98. I would say the Gravity Tour is probably better at getting a heavier spin ball, whereas the Speed Tour seems to give you a better penetrating ball. And there is still capable amounts of spin, but just not as much as the Gravity Tour because of that super open string pattern. The spin itself on this frame is quite high for a 97 especially. If you're using heavy control balls, the slow balls like a Slazenger or a Australian Open Dunlop ball, then you're only really going to notice that kind of spin potential when the balls are moderately fresh. But the problem is, once those balls die midway through the session, forget about it. You're probably not going to notice the spin potential or the power potential, because it's kind of hard to generate any kind of power and spin from any kind of racket using those kinds of balls. But if you're using more lively balls like the Wilson US Open, maybe the Wilson Tour balls, especially Babolats or anything like that, then you're going to notice the mass amounts of spin potential that this frame can surprisingly get. Where this racket kind of blends the elements of what I feel about a Radical MP, on the other hand, is that this has a lot of control and consistency. At the moment, I'm still kind of like figuring it out more so, but I don't think this has a lot of precise control in terms of wanting to hit your exact targets. And I am a very aggressive player, so I know how to hit my spots generally with most rackets if they have that pinpoint precision. But where this kind of has a lot of control is that super well-rounded consistency and the ability to give you confidence when you swing, because you can just keep swinging and swinging and swinging, and it's like that kind of racket that feels difficult to miss. And that's what I feel with the Radical MP. It's like it's just impossible to miss sometimes, and I'll just extend my rallies out way more longer than I would with any other of my regular frames. With this one, obviously, like I said, you get that boost in power and spin that you wouldn't get from the Radical MP, which is why I think it gives that nice balance. And it may not be as super maneuverable as the Radical MP, but it's by no means slow or sluggish, and not in the realm of what you feel with the Gravity Tour either. So that combination of spin, maneuverability, and power blend really well together to give you the ability to stay in rhythm and just make a ton of balls without having to lay off your pace too much. Especially for me on the really lively bouncing surfaces like some of the hard courts or onto car courts here with super lively balls. This racket, I felt, has some of the best control in terms of like really dialing that in on the receiving end. So when balls are bouncing way above your head and you kind of need to like get extra spin or try to drive through the ball, this really keeps the ball in check a lot. Even when I'm playing in really lively conditions and some of these really hotter days in the Australian summer, the control that I was able to get from this racket was far beyond other rackets that I was using in those same conditions. And this kind of allowed me to extend rallies, like I said, despite being that 97 square inch. I don't think you would feel it as much as you expect to in terms of the forgiveness levels, but at the same time, you still have to be a solid player to be maximizing this racket, because it does take some kind of energy and effort and better footwork to play with this frame. So just touching a little bit more about spin, I think the launch angle is quite fair. It definitely depends on what strings you use. So if you're using a very sharp string or spin-friendly string, then you can actually achieve quite a high launch angle despite such a tight string pattern. But then if you're going to use a rounder poly, that launch angle is really going to dip a lot and play a lot flatter than you'd want. So in my experiences is that you can get a ton of spin, a ton of height. I've been using this, like I said, on some clay courts to great effect, being able to extend the rallies, even using this on the one-hander. And if you need a bit more maneuverability, the good thing about at least these Speed Highball Tech frames is that they seem to have put back the weighted butt cap, which is about 7 grams. And if you have an old head butt cap, or you can even find some online on some stores, you can replace it with like a 2-gram flat butt cap, where it will remove like 5 grams for you. So this racket does play reasonably stable at such a light weight, and this is something that you've never really seen before, because you have the Perceps, the 97 Pro Staffs, and the Strike 97s being at an unstrung weight of about 310 grams or higher. So this is the first kind of 97 that I know of that can be 305 grams. That's not the Ultra Tour 97, which you needed to add weight to that. Whereas this one, I've been playing basically in bone stock, even though with the overgrip, I had the lighter grip set up underneath so that my static weight was about 322 grams strung. So for the stability, I know there's a lot of people that might think the stability is not enough on this frame, but I've been playing this in tournament settings and competition. I think it's reasonable amount. You obviously have to be a bit more of a cleaner ball striker to get away with that stability. So if you're someone who is used to letting the racket do more work for you, then obviously you're probably going to have to add weight. But in terms of stock form, I think this is pretty damn good in terms of playing it just as is. My swing weight wasn't necessarily too overspec either. It's falling around the 324, 325 range, depending on what string I use. I think it holds up pretty well on returner serves, like just blocking some higher pace serves. The most instability that you're going to feel is mainly because of the feel of the racket, which is probably like maybe the only thing that I can think of in terms of a possible con. But at the end of the day, it's kind of preferential, and also you can kind of fix that with your string choice too. So because the feel of the racket, the string bed is really responsive. So once the ball hits the racket, you don't get any time with the ball pocketing or dwell time. But if this racket was a little bit better in terms of the ball pocketing and dwell time, then I think that you would be able to let a lot more of the frame do some of the work for the stability. And you can kind of adjust this with the string choice. So my most preferred string that I've used in this racket has been Head Sonic Pro Tour Arpet version. And that's because the string itself is extremely soft and malleable, but it has still edges to get that spin that I need. And you can also do this by adjusting the string tension to be lower, but I think that this plays best in a regular setup in terms of tension. So I don't want to actually be lowering the tension. I've been playing with it at a higher than normal tension because it's been super hot here. So I've been stringing about 50 to 52 pounds. The thing with the Head Sonic Pro Tour string is that when you string with it and you hit this part of it, you get a little bit more ball pocketing, so that then the edges over here also kind of give in. It allows the frame to give you a bit more of a trampolining effect so that the ball will kind of sink in longer, and that is indirectly kind of helping manage the forgiveness and stability levels as well. But if you're using a string that's way too crisp and responsive, then you just basically give the racket no time to work with. Once you mishit, the whole thing is going to shank and essentially ricochet off the racket. So like I said, I kind of come from a more old school type of feel. I prefer a softer, more ball pocketing sensation, and this is very fast, but I'm just experimenting with a lot of different ones at the moment to see what might be the best. So far, I personally prefer a more muted kind of feeling string, so I didn't mind Hawk Touch in it, which was the factory string, but obviously that one is not going to have a super sharp or shaped profile, so then I'm not going to be able to get as much spin from the frame. And I have tried other ones like Hawk Touch Rough, which gave heaps of spin, but that one is like super reactive. Even probably one of the faster ones off the string bed. That one would pair probably really well with a very, very flexible soft racket. So despite the RA rating, like you don't really get that kind of feel that you would expect from being a 61 flex. I think maybe the high bore tech is basically makes it so solid all around, which for a lot of people can be a very good thing. And I don't really mind it too much, but I definitely like some more of that kind of gravity tour kind of feel, where as a super aggressive attacking player that I'm wanting to hit lines, that kind of feel is what helps me play my best in terms of pure attacking precision. Quickly for the serving, in terms of that, the thing with the serving is like I still have been having a shoulder injury since maybe a year ago. I'm not able to get the most out of my shoulder. I kind of have to lay off a little bit. But what I've noticed is that, you know, it flattens pretty well. The controller's definitely all there, but you'll see that the kick serve is actually pretty good. And I was using some very heavy balls and they were still able to kind of jump over shoulder height. So that in itself is quite impressive for a racket that you wouldn't think probably could generate that kind of spin. Now, the only thing I'm not quite sure is like, how would this kind of perform in terms of a pro tour kind of setting? I'm sure that there are obviously some athletic freaks that can use these kind of rackets, because you still have people who are using very highly controlled heavy rackets. And obviously this one, depending on who the player is and how they feel about it, they could easily suit this one. But given the outlook of the current tour with the Aero 98, E-Zone 98s all becoming the main go-to frames, it's very difficult to kind of put this in that territory. But what I can say for sure is in terms of the recreational level to the 5.0 level, so a reasonable advanced level, this frame is actually extremely good. I think there is definitely a place for it. And for me, I kind of have like a small racket rotation when I go to matches at the moment, with the E-Zone 100L being obviously my top choice. And then if I need to switch it up, I want to play with something different, I usually go to the E-Zone 98L or the E-Zone 98 2022 version. But for the Speed Tour, it's actually kind of taken over my E-Zone 98L for some of these occasions, even though it's a bit more controlled, a bit stiffer feeling. But I think this is a really good racket that helps me swing out, especially if I'm in a kind of a nervous state where if I'm swinging out, I might not have all the rhythm, so I might be kind of overshooting it, but I can kind of like go hard with this racket and still be able to keep the ball in quite easily. So then that kind of can calm down my nerves and allow me to find more rhythm when I'm in kind of a dire state. I don't think we've seen a 97 square inch racket perform like this, considering the current outlook of what's available and the weights, the static weights that they are available in. So you got a racket here that is kind of outside the norm. Definitely something for people to look in terms of blending some control and power into one racket while still maintaining high maneuverability and obviously a little bit of stability even in stock form. I'm still mostly experimenting this racket, and then I'll be doing the Speed MP very closely after. So I'll leave that to my final review. I would say that most of my thoughts are pretty solidified already, but I'll make better comparisons to other competing frames in the market in my final review. So that basically sums up a bit of my general thoughts. That kind of gives you a bit of an idea of what this Speed Tour kind of brings to the market. But I think this is a versatile frame and can suit quite a lot of people. Still more on the advanced side, I would say, but nothing short of impressive in my book. So that kind of concludes my first impressions. Hopefully I'll start working on the full review as well as the Speed MP. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.